Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Environmental Transitions. I am Panwin Yoking, a fellow at the East-West Center, and I am delighted to moderate today's session. Thank you for joining us live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. Our EWC Insights this afternoon features Zena Grecni. Zena is the Sustained Climate Assessment Specialist for the Pacific RISA, a NOAA Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Team. Based at the East-West Center in Honolulu, she works with a network of federal, state, and local partners to synthesize climate information and coordinate assessments for the US-affiliated Pacific Islands region. She served as a chapter author for the US 4th National Climate Assessment and as lead author for the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment for Guam and for the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. She received her master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of Environment and has more than a decade of experience in the Pacific Islands. In today's session, Zena will share findings from the Pacific Island Regional Climate Assessment, a collaborative effort that brings together scientific information about climate change in the Pacific Islands region and highlights knowledge to improve policy choices. And before we start, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Zena's presentation will be approximately 40 minutes long. Then we will transition to a 20 minutes Q&A session. And to participate in the Q&A session, please submit your questions and comments, suggestions in the Q&A box down below. And we will try our very best to get through all of the questions, as many questions as possible. Dr. Jefferson Fox, the acting director of the research program, is behind the screen monitoring the Q&A box. And just a quick announcement that our next 3 series of EWC Insights will focus on demographic change. And the first speaker for this series will be Dr. Andrew Mason, who will discuss Asia-Pacific demographic transitions and regional economic growth. So if you're interested in attending, his talk will be held on June 16th at 2 p.m. And in the interest of time, I will end the introduction here and hand this over to Zena to start her presentation.
Aloha and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, Panwin, for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here on East-West Center Insights and to have the opportunity to share with you an update about the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment, a collaborative effort to assess how climate is changing and how leaders are navigating that change here in the Pacific Islands region. I'll now share my slides. I work, as Panwin said, with the Pacific RISA research team. It's a team funded by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and we support Hawaii and the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands, the region that you can see right here. Supporting assessments and coordinating science in such a region is no easy task. It's vast, with more than 2,000 islands, about 2 million people, spread over an area that's larger than the size of the continental US. There are varied governance structures across the region. There's 1 US state, 3 US territories, and 3 independent nations that are freely associated with the United States through the Compact of Free Association. There are high volcanic islands like here in Hawaii and low-lying atolls like those of the Marshall Islands. The region is as diverse socially and culturally as it is geographically, with per capita GDPs ranging from 3,000 to just over 52,000 here in Hawaii. The region is host to incredible biodiversity, most prominently on this map represented by the green areas, which show the federally designated marine protected areas. It has important US military installations like Indo-PACOM here in Hawaii and also the Kwajalein Missile Defense System. And we've often heard small island states in this region called large ocean states because their economic zones, their exclusive economic zones, the gray areas around each islands are large areas of ocean that contain incredible resources. And I think important to today's discussion about climate assessments, the current US federal efforts to model future climate change at a local scale do not extend to the US affiliated Pacific Islands, and until very recently did not extend to Hawaii. So I think we play an important role in revealing how climate change is affecting these areas and what the future might hold. So conducting comprehensive assessments in such a vast and diverse region requires partnering with many people. The PIRCA is a collaborative climate assessment effort for the Pacific Islands, and the PIRCA provides this regional independent umbrella that involves federal, regional, and local government entities, universities, NGOs, nonprofits, and businesses. And it's not owned by any one group, although it's coordinated by the Pacific RISA. This shared ownership allows it to be flexible and nimble and reflect the many issues that are unique to the specific places, and as well as issues that are shared regionally. The PIRCA has been working for more than a decade. The first comprehensive regional climate assessment was released in 2012. It was an input to the third US National Climate Assessment. In between major US national climate assessments, the network has continued to lead work tracking physical climate indicators, looking at the data and assessing the pace and extent of climate change. And then the network was reinvigorated in 2016 through 2018 when it developed a chapter for the US Fourth National Climate Assessment. And now the collaboration is in the process of producing and releasing assessments for each of the US affiliated Pacific Island jurisdictions through a multi-year process. And I'm going to particularly focus on this most recent phase of the PIRCA in 2020 and 2021 for today's talk. Knowing that we collected much more information from our network than could be contained in a single chapter in the National Climate Assessment, and knowing that we still had a Hawaii heavy focus, we launched this process to update the 2012 PIRCA report. And we really listened to what people are asking for. And from that feedback, decided that the next set of PIRCA products would be shorter climate science summaries that are relevant to each of the US affiliated Pacific Island jurisdictions. This means doing a summary and an assessment for the territory of Guam, one for American Samoa, one for Palau, one for the Mariana Islands, and so forth. And working as a team, we held workshops and meetings in 2019 in 4 of these jurisdictions. Now we have the goal to eventually reach all 6 US affiliated Pacific Island or US API jurisdictions, but unfortunately COVID hampered our initial plans to visit the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia in 2020. And so we hope to get there to the remaining 2 in the coming months or years. In each place that the PIRCA team visited to develop the jurisdictional climate science assessments, we spent about 4 or 5 days. And we held a workshop, which was the kind of focal point for our visit, fitting into local partners' already scheduled activities and meetings, and trying to bring together experts and decision makers who are working on the ground, already facing impacts from climate change, and skillfully building resilience. In American Samoa, we drew on networks that were already established by our colleagues from the Hawaii Water Resources Research Center, who've been working with water and energy managers there for some years. In Palau, we partnered with the Office of Climate Change at the national level. They're interested in using the report as the scientific basis for their national adaptation plan. In the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, we tailored the workshop to fit within a coastal adaptation training run by the NOAA Office for Coastal Management and by local partners, especially the Bureau of Environmental and Coastal Quality. This workshop came in between 2 extremely powerful typhoons that affected the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands within a year of each other, and on the heels of Super Typhoon Yutu. And so much of the conversation here focused on the future of major storms and extreme events. In Guam, we worked with the leadership of the newly formed Guam Climate Change Commission and combined our workshop with their first working meeting. And as I mentioned, apologies. As I mentioned before, we haven't been able to visit the Marshall Islands or the Federated States of Micronesia, but we're working closely with the National Disaster Management Office in the Marshall Islands right now, and developing through a series of meetings and review by a climate science working group, an assessment summary for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So we hope to be able to meet with partners and colleagues in Micronesia soon. And we drafted, ahead of each visit, we drafted an assessment summary, and then we refined and ground truthed it with local experts and managers that attended the workshop and with whom we met outside of the workshop. And this really helped us to gather input for the major sections of the assessment, which focused on trends in climate data and future projections. They focused on how climate change is affecting families, households, and vulnerable populations, how climate change is affecting key sectors like energy, agriculture, water resources, et cetera. And we also gathered input on the main needs for research and information to support adaptation and climate change risk management efforts that are underway. So listed here are some of the main sectors and groups represented. There was some variation in each place, but we aimed for a broad cross-section. And it's important to note that all the participants were recognized as technical contributors. They had the opportunity to review subsequent drafts and gave their knowledge and input, really shared it freely with us. This was incredibly important in making the reports locally relevant, and it shaped the content of each assessment. There were also several co-authors who took on a larger volunteer share of the report writing and gave us particularly helpful input, keeping the assessment scientifically rigorous and accurate. And so far, the PERCA network has published 3 of these assessments. So the assessments for Palau and Guam were released in the last quarter of 2020. The one for CNMI was released just in January. And we are in the final stages of formatting and laying out the American Samoa assessment. We're actually translating a summary of it into Samoan, which is great, and I'm excited about that part in particular. So American Samoa is forthcoming in the next month. Examples of how governments and decision makers are already using the reports include citing it in adaptation funding proposals. It's been used, as I mentioned, in Palau's National Climate Change Adaptation Planning. It inspired new legislation for innovative coral reef insurance mechanisms in Guam. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands has used it in updates to their resource plans, and it was recently used in testimony in support of the Insular Area Climate Change Act, which is a bill introduced earlier this month in the US House. So for the remainder of the presentation, I really want to focus on the findings of these reports, and I know time is limited, so I'll focus on how climate change is affecting the region as a whole, with specific examples drawn from Palau, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. So what does the PERCA, this assessment, tell us about how global climate change is affecting the local climate of the Pacific Islands? We can see it through a number of key climate indicators. Like around the globe, we know that carbon dioxide concentrations are rising. Human activities release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, mainly through the burning of fossil fuels, and to a lesser extent through changes in land use and agriculture. And as a result, the greenhouse effect is intensifying and warming the Earth. And we see temperatures over land and over the ocean rising. We see sea levels rising. Rainfall patterns are changing, and cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons are becoming more intense. And these and many other changes are measurable, and they have real impacts on people's lives. Global warming has arrived in the Pacific Islands. It is no longer a future issue, it's here right now. Rising air temperatures can be seen in all of the Pacific Islands countries and territories where we've conducted assessments. And averaged across Oceania, the 5 hottest years on record have all happened since 2005. Shown here are the number of hot days over time in locations around the region in American Samoa and Guam there on the left, and in Palau and CNMI there on the right. What is considered a hot day was defined for each location specifically based on that place's local climate. Dr. Abby Fraser at the East West Center put together these charts, and she was not working with as much climate data as she would have been if working in the contiguous United States. Some US states have hundreds of weather stations that measure hourly and daily air temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind speeds, et cetera. And we were lucky to find one record of sufficient quality for each of the jurisdictions for the PERCA. It takes about 30 years or more of good quality long-term climate data to produce and validate future climate projections. And so it's especially important that we increase the coverage and quality of these data records that are needed for projections that can help in agriculture, infrastructure planning, energy planning, and other sectors. Globally, tropical cyclones, that's typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, and tropical storms are getting stronger. Tropical cyclones observed since about 1980 show that globally, the intensity of cyclones has increased slightly. The strengthening can already be seen in the South Pacific and around American Samoa. And further intensification of cyclone wind speeds of between 5 and 50% are expected by 2100. Likewise, rainfall amounts, storm surge heights during these storms are also projected to increase. And recently, a number of very destructive storms have affected the Pacific Islands, including the two super typhoons, Yutu and Soledor, that hit the that hit the Mariana Islands in a span of just 3 years in 2015 through 2018. Jim Cosin, who's an atmospheric research scientist at NOAA, says the culprit for these hyperactive typhoon seasons that we've seen is warmer than average ocean temperatures. So the heating up of the Earth's oceans is really fueling typhoon seasons that are more active and that stretch over longer periods of months. It's also fueling the rapid intensification of storms once they do form. And we'll see as a result, more high category storms, category 4 and 5 cyclones in the future. So it's something, the cyclone climatology is something to carefully watch if you're interested in Pacific Islands or anywhere in the world affected by cyclones and hurricanes. El Nino years in particular, because of hotter ocean temperatures in those years, fuel more active tropical cyclones in the Western and Central Pacific. In the summer of 2015, during an El Nino, we saw 6 major storms that threatened or impacted the Mariana Islands and Guam. This satellite photo was taken at the beginning of July of that year when 3 cyclones were simultaneously affecting the Western Pacific and running into East Asia. Many communities that are exposed to strong storms develop pre-disaster recovery plans. So this is one strategy that helps in pre-planning for the rebuilding and recovery phases after a disaster hits. That way, governments can seize opportunities and funding for improving resilience to future disasters by upgrading infrastructure and building back in a way that is more able to withstand stronger storms and other changes. And the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands government has started this planning. They, with support from FEMA and the EPA, developed guidance manual for smart, safe growth, which outlines hazard mitigation and climate change adaptation that can be in part put in place in the wake of storms in the rebuilding phase. The majority of Pacific Island communities we know are confined to a narrow band of land within just a few feet of sea level. And sea level is very likely to rise as much as 1 foot by 2050 and by as much as 4 feet by 2100. But the ultimate magnitude and timing is still uncertain. And recent science suggests from looking at Arctic ice sheet stability that an extreme scenario of about 8 feet by 2100 is physically possible. It's not, the likelihood of this extreme scenario currently can't be assessed, but the National Climate Assessment found that sea level rise could be very extreme. And sea level rise does not happen evenly around the globe. It's not like a bathtub rising and filling up. It's distributed unevenly for a variety of reasons. And in the Pacific, sea level rise is amplified and will be higher than the global average. And some local effects like earthquakes causing land subsidence in American Samoa, for example, will add significantly to the sea level rise that they're seeing locally. This map here shows the possible extent of flooding on a portion of Saipan's western coast in southern Garapan in 50 years during an extreme high tide under a trajectory of warming that's consistent with our current warming. It highlights that the impacts are substantial to both land and residential and commercial infrastructure, with possible economic losses, particularly in areas where tourism and other income generating activities are taking place. And this scenario is really only about 1.2 feet, so nowhere near some of the higher scenarios that I just mentioned. Highly impacted areas at risk on Saipan include US military infrastructure, the American Memorial Park. It's a national park that commemorates American service members and Chamorro and Carolinian civilians that were lost during battles in the US, between the US and Japan on Saipan. Threatened resources also include marine protected areas and tourism areas in Garapan that are the driver for Saipan and the CNMI's economy. And the government has established some planning scenarios using imagery like this and using NOAA's sea level rise projections. And they can use these scenarios in planning and siting new infrastructure that will last 50 to 100 years that's being considered today. And a range of factors affect the sea level that's experienced in a particular location at a particular time. So not just sea level rise, but also factors like high tides and waves, storm surges from typhoons, vertical land motion. And high tide flooding is already experienced in certain communities in Pacific Islands, like this neighborhood here in Palau on Koror, where residents have observed fluctuations in the order of 7 feet or more. I also wanted to mention that sea level rise can affect freshwater supplies, and climate change in general brings a whole host of challenges for the management of freshwater resources. This figure was featured in the Guam Parker report. It shows current recharge to the aquifer, the main aquifer, the northern Guam lens aquifer, that supplies most household and drinking water to Guam. And in the present at the right, you can see current recharge rates compared with, at the left are present recharge rates. And at the right are future end of 21st century rates of recharge. And you can see that due to a possible decline in rainfall, coupled with hotter conditions and greater evaporation rates, recharge is projected to decrease. Human communities also use more water when it's hotter for things like drinking and washing and whatnot. So, and cooling for energy. So, there are a multitude of reasons that climate change may decrease water supplies, even if rainfall rates remain the same or even increase a little. In the Mariana Islands, just to the north of Guam, Saipan's power plant and electrical infrastructure and other energy infrastructure are concentrated in FEMA designated flood zones. So they're already at risk of flooding in today's climate. They're also exposed under the CNMI's sea level rise planning scenarios that I mentioned earlier. So hardening measures that improve the design of these infrastructure assets will possibly protect the resilience of electrical, water, wastewater, and other infrastructure. And Saipan is already reinforcing some assets that are vulnerable to wind damage, like electrical poles. They also could install microgrids, which are capable of isolating themselves from the rest of the grid during a storm event and promoting self-sufficiency during these times of wider spread outages. So, some critical assets may even need to be relocated away from flood zones, all of which involves actually large upfront costs, even though there are potentially large savings down the line. And as I mentioned, these large upfront costs, this is in the context, for at least the Northern Mariana Islands, of a current economic crisis. Already, the Mariana Islands were struck by several typhoons, and the pandemic, the global COVID pandemic, essentially shuttered their tourism, which is their largest contributor to the economy. And so this partial closure resulted in the need to shut down government for several months in 2020, and has an ongoing effect on their ability to implement some of these really good planning measures that need to happen to keep communities safe from climate change. And so, places like the Northern Mariana Islands are going to need assistance from the rest of the world to be able to keep their people safe. Adding to the uncertainty in rainfall and extremes in the Pacific Islands is the El Nino Southern Oscillation and how it may change in the future. This phenomenon has three phases: El Nino, La Nina, and neutral. And depending on what phase it's in, it can dramatically affect precipitation, air and ocean temperatures, sea surface heights, storminess, wave size, and a whole host of climate variables. We know, for example, that El Nino in the central and western Pacific brings a period of heavy rainfall, typically delivered in strong storms and typhoons, followed by very dry conditions, a period of drought. And in 2015 and 16, during that El Nino, the Marshall Islands, as well as the rest of Micronesia, experienced some pretty severe drought, which led to wildfires, the need for water supply restrictions, domestic use restrictions, and in some places actually ran out of water. You can see the US Navy unloading reverse osmosis units in this photo in the Marshall Islands, actually in a different drought, but this is the kind of response that sometimes drought can entail in the Pacific. We don't know exactly how El Nino and La Nina events may change in the future. There have been some increases in the strength of them that have been observed, and recent climate modeling results suggest a potential doubling in frequency of both El Nino and La Nina extremes during the 21st century. So it's something to watch, especially for seasonal drought planning. More extreme storms, heat waves, floods, and other events that climate change is intensifying all affect human health. Climate change sometimes affects health in non-direct and non-intuitive ways. The Pacific Islands are not known around the world for their wildfires in the same way that California and the American West are. But nonetheless, wildfire is a big and growing issue on Pacific Islands. Wildfires can ignite and spread more easily in hotter, drier conditions. Already in Guam, for example, about 3% of the land burns annually. And in some drought years and seasons, this reaches more like 7% of the total land area burning. This percentage of land burned annually is greater than that of the Western United States. So wildfire is a serious issue. Wildfire poses a direct risk to safety, of course, but it also produces smoke and fine particles that fill the air and threaten health, especially for children and people with respiratory conditions. And schools have closed sometimes in Guam in and around fire areas, in part due to the health risk from smoke. Other ways that that climate change affects human health include heat as a stressor for other diseases. Rates of non-communicable diseases are higher in the Pacific Islands than in the United States as a whole. And hospitalizations and death rates are higher during heat waves for people with certain underlying conditions like heart disease and respiratory issues. Dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and other mosquito-borne pathogens have increased as global health threats in recent years, and have also been noticed in Pacific Islands recently. These outbreaks have been more common and seem to be getting more severe. Globally, the suitable habitat for pathogens and their vectors is increasing with climate change, changes in rainfall, for example. And extreme weather also affects the entire health system. So the facilities that provide care are affected by extreme events like floods and hurricanes or storms. People seeking care are challenged by extreme weather events. So we need to really think about health holistically and consider all the ways that climate change may be affecting the ability to seek care and the ability to provide care. And public health departments across the Pacific Islands are really seriously starting to consider these issues. Community level adaptation measures really promise to provide a lot of support in the area of health and disease prevention. So efforts to map and track vector-borne diseases in the Mariana Islands have helped. And throughout the Pacific, educating people about ways to reduce mosquitoes in the environment can really reduce the vulnerability to disease. Ecosystems have the potential to provide some of the most cost-effective protections from climate change impacts. For example, coral reefs provide coastal protection during strong storms, but ecosystems themselves are coming under threat from climate change. Warming ocean waters are causing coral reefs to bleach more often and more intensely. The map to the right shows the percent coral cover change around Saipan in the Mariana Islands between 2012 and 2018. The darker red colors indicate areas of more coral loss. So this isn't just bleaching, but actual death of coral populations. You can see that some areas have experienced over this time frame coral cover decline of more than 80%. And higher ocean temperatures and heat stress in 2017 was the worst recorded on record across Micronesia. Scientists Jeff Maynard and Steve McKagan led surveys and a team to track this coral cover decline and really map all the different sites. Each number on this map represents a different site that was studied. And overall, they found coral cover declined 67% on average over the 35 sites surveyed. There is some positive news potentially here in that some corals in Palau and certain bays in Guam have been seen to be more resilient due to internal tides and just the local factors there. And so we're hoping that corals will be able to adapt, but really the rate at which they can adapt will make a huge difference as climate change continues. Unfortunately, the outlook for coral reefs is more dire than for a lot of other ecosystems. On this figure to the left, darker red colors mean sooner onset of annual bleaching. And reefs are projected to bleach annually across the Pacific before 2050, some beginning in 2030s here, as you can see. So this is not a future issue. This is an issue right now, and that will begin to seriously affect ecosystems that tourism and other and many livelihoods depend on in the next 10 years or so. And intertwined with these environments and inseparable from them is the cultures of the Pacific Island Indigenous communities. And climate change impacts the environments and ecosystems, and likewise it impacts cultural sites and resources, as well as subsistence practices like agriculture, agroforestry, fishing, traditional aquaculture. But at the same time, local and cultural knowledge is really essential and has a very important role to play in adaptation planning. Traditional knowledge is derived from the sharing of environmental observations across many generations. And in that way, it's useful for defining environmental baselines and also for understanding historical and culturally grounded responses to climate variability. that have helped Pacific peoples to be resilient to changes in the past. Cultural practitioners really can play an important role in ensuring place-based knowledge is incorporated into resilience planning and to adaptation actions. So although climate change will affect everyone, one thing that we've heard again and again throughout the PERCA process and through these workshops and our interactions with people is that some people will be at greater risk from the impacts than others. So those who are already vulnerable, such as older people, children, people with disabilities, people with pre-existing conditions, and people experiencing poverty will be more exposed to certain impacts. We know that almost all the food and energy in the Pacific Islands is imported. And with climate change affecting places around the world, price shocks and shifts in global supply of goods are very likely in the future. And those elevated food and energy prices, for example, will hit low-income communities the hardest. Children have higher rates of heat-related illness and heat stroke than do healthy adults, as do people with pre-existing conditions, as I mentioned. And people who work outdoors, like those in tourism or construction industries, are some of the first to be exposed to high heat or other extremes in climate and weather. So we have populations in the Pacific Islands, as we all know, that are concentrated in the industries like tourism and outdoor activities. These same industries are also more impacted by climate change because they rely on healthy ecosystems, coral reefs, the continued existence of beaches that make the Pacific Islands so attractive for people to visit. And so adaptive tourism plans might involve diversifying the types of resources that are attractive for these tourism activities. And these are just a few. Many, many other issues affect certain populations more than others. Throughout the PERCA workshops, we tried to ask groups of managers and decision makers what kind of research and information they need to support their ongoing risk management efforts regarding climate change. And there were many answers to this question, and each of the reports includes a section on specific needs for that location, that jurisdiction. But across the countries and territories, there were some common themes, and they're captured here on this slide. For example, again and again, we heard that visualizations like maps that support adaptation planning, especially to sea level rise, are really important for understanding the local impacts of sea level rise, and particularly when those visualizations and mapping involve all the different dynamics at play, like waves and storms and extremes in addition to sea level rise. We know that we need improved quality and expanded coverage of climate data. Decision makers also asked for better understanding of groundwater resources and water resources in general, particularly understanding what are the limitations and how they can improve management so that it's more resilient. Research on climate proofing critical infrastructure and trials of projects that improve the resilience of infrastructure were requested. Actually all of the Pacific Island governments have renewable energy small-scale pilot projects, and they're interested in scaling up renewable energy, both as a way to contribute to the solutions to climate change globally, but also to cushion and shield themselves from the price shocks that could come from shifting energy supply. Currently, all energy, essentially, except for very small-scale projects on renewable energy, is imported to the Pacific Islands, and it's all fossil fuel-based. And so studies on the potential for solar and wind and other energy sources that are zero emissions are of interest to the governments and communities there. Community-based research, looking at how local communities can build climate change readiness with the assistance of the government or even just from the grassroots level were requested. Adaptive tourism plans and vulnerability assessments for cultural and historical sites were also needs that we heard again and again. So clearly Pacific Islanders are applying their resources and creativity to respond to climate events, to keep people safe, and to build resilience to future climate change. But are we listening? Is the question that I'd like to ask. And I've provided some reactions from leaders across the Pacific here on the next slides to showcase how Pacific Island leaders have really been a moral conscience for the world in the climate change negotiations. And as we discuss the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. And there are many, many examples like the Guam Climate Change Commission, like the Palau National Climate Change Policy, like Guam Green Growth and how Hawaii Green Growth has been supporting resilience building across the Pacific, and the Micronesian Challenge, and so many other examples of really powerful leadership around adapting and figuring out new ways to make communities more resilient. But the region is still in crisis from climate change. Time and again, leaders have stated that climate change is real. It's happening, it's already affecting the islands, and it's an existential threat. But these actions that leaders are taking are also being hindered by extreme events, intense typhoons, the COVID pandemic, which has devastated their economies, just to name a few, hinder efforts to be more forward-looking and to implement adaptation. And so they need the world backing them as they face this challenge with creativity and all that they have to offer. And the rest of the world will continue to benefit from their leadership, but we do need to listen. I want to end it there, but before doing so, I want to especially thank all of the authors and technical contributors of the PERCA reports. This assessment effort would not have been possible without the volunteer time and expertise that local scientists and managers and experts and leaders have put into it. And as a result, I think the assessments are locally relevant and scientifically rigorous. And I hope that they will be useful going forward. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion and any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Zena, for the very informative presentation. It's your presentation, it is striking to realize that even though the Pacific Island states contribute very little to greenhouse gas emission, millions of Pacific Islanders have to bear the severe and destructive consequences of climate change. And in the interest of time, I'm seeing several questions coming in, so let's turn to the Q&A session. And the first question that we have is, let me scroll up. Thank you for the comprehensive discussion of the climate change related problems in the Pacific. If you have to name the top 3, what are they?
That's a great question. You know, throughout the process of developing the PERCA assessments, we really tried to rely on people who are on the ground making decisions and living with climate change in the Pacific Islands, in Palau, in Guam, in the Northern Mariana Islands. So I would hesitate to say what are the most serious issues, just because I think that we're best hearing those from the people who are experiencing them. However, I will say that many of these climate issues do not happen in isolation. They kind of interact and build on one another. And we see this with the issue of sea level rise affecting coastlines. So we see coral reef health declining. At the same time, other ecosystems like mangroves, beaches, sand dunes that also provide a lot of really high quality protection are being removed through development and through human activity. And so the collision of these factors with climate change and sea level rise, I think creates for low-lying areas where our communities are concentrated, a very dire situation. And there's a lot of opportunity here, I think, to live with sea level rise and to relocate, reinvent what buildings and transportation and other critical infrastructure look like to accommodate the sea level rise. But I would say, top issue, if I could name just one, if that's okay, would be this collision of events bringing sea level rise to the top and making communities very vulnerable to it.
Got it. Thank you for the answer. I'll move on to the next question, but let me provide a context given from the attendee first and then followed by the question. So on my small, low atoll island in Yup State in Micronesia, in addition to the clearly visible changes of the ocean and land atmosphere, we have also been witnessing frequent appearances of never before sighted species of fish, shark, birds, and etc., as well as increasing disappearance of those that we are accustomed to. So this essentially affects the food chain. Is this whole change of behavior has anything to do with climate change?
It could. I would, need to direct you to some researchers who work more than I do on species distributions and habitat changes as a result of warming temperatures, changing extreme events, et cetera. But there are a few things I'll point out. One is that some of the critical breeding and nesting grounds for birds and sea turtles throughout the Pacific are on low-lying atolls. And so, thank you for sharing your experience on Yap. I know that some storms, hurricanes, and typhoons have essentially created overwash that's completely temporarily submerged whole atolls where nesting seabirds and turtles go at certain times of year to reproduce. And those are very critical grounds. And so, there are certain efforts like on Oahu, on the island where I live in Hawaii, to relocate some of those young birds so that they imprint on a higher elevation area and then return to it through the rest of their life to breed and nest. And so I know there are other issues with species already migrating or already shifting their ranges, I should say. So tuna and billfish populations, which of course are economically extremely important to the Pacific, are shifting northward as ocean temperatures rise. So it's entirely possible that some of the changes you're seeing are due to climate change. And we need better science on this. So if you are a scientist or at least somebody who can take local observations, please write about them and share them with the rest of us in the Pacific.
Thank you, Zena. The next question we have from the audience is, how does localized food production and protection fit in?
That's a great question. I know there's been assessments of food and agriculture and the potential impacts of climate change on food and agriculture in the Pacific Islands. The Secretariat of the Pacific Islands Regional Environment Program, or SPREP, as well as the SPC, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, works a lot on food security, and they have great publications. I know one of the findings that caught my eye from one of their publications and assessments on food security was that local and traditional agricultural techniques, so subsistence farming practices that have been in use for many, many generations, are actually more resilient to certain climate changes like rising sea levels because they've been selected over time to accommodate climate variability like king tide events. And so, I think we have a lot to learn from that ecological knowledge and generational knowledge that's been built. It's a huge wealth that I think a lot of people can benefit in the Pacific. But right now we know that food is largely imported. About 80 or 90% of the food that we eat here on the islands comes in on big ships. And if extreme weather events cut off the ability to access the harbor or delay or cause destruction to the shipping industry, then we're at a loss to be able to feed ourselves. And so I hope this kind of gets at your question that part of planning and adaptation to climate change must focus on certainly recultivating more subsistence practices in a way that are adaptive and forward-looking to the changes to come.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. And the next interesting question we have from the audience is, you mentioned the impact of climate change on thin water lengths to some low-lying atolls. And this is what keeps us grounded to the islands. Without it, and even if the islands are still floating, life cannot be sustained. Thus, climate refugees is a likely solution. Are there governments putting this potential problem into their strategic plans?
Yeah, as I was hearing your question read, I was thinking of a conversation I've been having with a representative of the National Disaster Management Office in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. It's a conversation I've actually had with her over the course of the past year. And I know that the Marshall Islands are particularly interested in this issue of freshwater lens, susceptibility to rising sea levels and overwash events. I know that some research has shown that there may be thresholds earlier in the century than we would hope on certain atolls. I think one thing I've learned from talking with my colleague at the National Disaster Management Office is that we need better research into the thresholds, like what is the precise level of sea level rise and an extreme event that could compromise a freshwater lens. And create an issue in which water would have to be imported, or we'd need to store more water ahead of time. So I think these localized studies can really help with that, using observations where we don't have a lot of modeling from the scientific community. As far as migration, just to touch on that real quick, because of the ancestral ties to land and the Pacific and the cultural identity that's rooted in place and many other reasons that other people can articulate better than I can, migration is seen as a last resort, if not, and sometimes people see it not even as an option that they want to explore. And that's understandable. And I think is also a reason for, continuing to work on the cause of climate change and really ambitious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, thank you, Zena. The next question we have is, with traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, you mentioned that they could help and it's important for climate change adaptation. Do you think helping Indigenous people of the Pacific can help to adapt or action out practical ways to provide solutions to climate change?
It sounds like a good suggestion. I'm not sure I'm comprehending the question exactly, but I think traditional ecological knowledge has a very important role to play in adaptation. We heard, that certain species and resources are threatened, but others can provide historical experiences, using them and creating resilience on an island scale through understanding ecosystems and resources and species. And so I think we really need to to listen to Indigenous communities and also recognize that knowledge and be very clear about acknowledging who carries that knowledge and supporting them and uplifting their voices.
Got it. Okay, so the next question we have is your findings make a case for teaching climate change mitigation through the humanities, and you just mentioned the attention to Indigenous knowledge, but how is this being collected and used as a data?
I'm also not sure that I understand this question exactly, so I hope I'm doing it justice, and thank you for it. I think this is getting at the important role that arts and humanities play in helping us deal with climate change and the psychological burdens that it places on people, as well as the histories, bringing forth the histories of people that have in the Pacific that have dealt with crisis and change and colonialism for so long. And so, there are really incredible artists in the Pacific Islands and literatures and an incredible wealth of art and poetry and writing that we can look to help us all cope with climate change. And I think I come away from reading works by Julian Agon and by Kathy Jetnil-Kijner and others feeling uplifted somehow, even though their works touch on issues of colonialism, of climate change, but they do so in a way that really reveals the beauty of the Pacific Islands and the incredible richness of culture and Indigenous knowledge. So I just would encourage people to check out those bodies of literature and continue to share them and learn more and uncover more art and literature that's so vast in the Pacific.
Okay, thank you. We have about 2 minutes left, so I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. And the next question is, as you know, everywhere the climate change is responsible for changing ways of life. In India's Sundarban, the mangrove is, which is very famous all over the world, is now facing problems related with livelihood. What is your opinion regarding this situation?
I am certainly no expert in India or any other region, but in the Sundarbans, I know has incredible biodiversity, but is also facing threats because it's low-lying. And mangroves here in the Pacific, have provided fuel and food through fisheries and estuaries that nurture young fish. They provide housing materials. And so they've been used quite heavily and also have come up against encroaching developments. And as a result, we've lost a lot of the capacity of mangroves to buffer our coast against sea level rise and coastal storms. But they are incredibly important, rich resources. And there are ways that managers and land use can encourage the migration of mangroves landward. And so, maybe that's something to consider as an exchange of knowledge between the Pacific and other places like India that have greater mangrove resources. Maybe there's something to be learned from managers talking to each other about how they're encouraging that migration and adaptation.
Got it. Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I'm gonna squeeze in one last question. And so this question is, what are your partnerships looking like and doing for this crises in places like Yelp?
Yeah, I don't know of specific partnerships within the Pacific RISA team, which is the research team I work for in YAP. We certainly would like to produce an assessment, as I mentioned, for the Federated States of Micronesia. And we welcome people from FSM and other places in Micronesia to get in touch with us. You can visit pacificrisa.org to learn more about the team's work in general. And I would just really like to partner with more people on an assessment for the Federated States of Micronesia that can make it useful and relevant to policymaking and decisions there.
Got it. Unfortunately, it's 3 p.m. We are running out of time, so the session has to end here. And if you are interested in learning more about Zena's work, they are available via the pacificresa.org website. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Zena, for sharing your work, and to all our audience and participants for joining us this afternoon. And again, I invite you to join our next EWC Insights on June 16th for a talk by Dr. Mason. And until then, have a